that's true. Naked Palpatine.
Oh, you pick that one. Fresh out of the clone tank, nude Palpatine is my
Well, that's the first thing I think of when you say Dark Empire Palpatine.
Hello everybody, and welcome to The Fall of Hyperion, Book 2 of Dan Simmons' Hyperion Cantos quadrilogy. It's 4 books. Though this is kind of like the second half of Hyperion. Like, it could have been 1 book. In fact, I think that was kind of the idea, but it wasn't allowed to be. The structure of this book is a lot different. In the previous book, the main plot, which is kind of on the back burner, was that 5 pilgrims were sent to go to this meeting with the Shrike. And while they were on their pilgrimage to said location, they each told their tale of their encounter with the mysterious Shrike. So we got a bunch of basically short stories in there. But then it just kind of ends. So if you want a conclusion to that, you kind of have to read this. But that being said, it's not like that in this case. There's no more short stories. It's no longer sci-fi Canterbury Tales. It's more like, well, we get hijacked by a completely new main character who is very relevant, even if it doesn't seem like that at first glance. And we get vignettes of the characters we came to love in the first book showing up in this book because their story continues in real time here. And a bunch of revelations are made. There's a bunch of crazy, wacky stuff going on. And thematically, there's a lot of stuff going on too. Stuff that I don't inherently agree with. But I think if you're non-religious, there's a lot of mysticism or wonder that you can grab from this book to perhaps have a sort of religious experience with no religion. I don't know if that makes sense. And if you are religious, monotheistic or whatever, I think there are still ways to glean transcendent objective truth in here, despite the conclusions Dan Simmons is making. But overall, I mean, it's really jarring to go from the last book to this book and follow a completely different character who is able to dream of our main characters in the first book. And our main characters are basically side characters in this plot. They do get time to shine, each one of them. And emotionally, I think this still hits pretty hard, which I think is important because I think I'm not super well versed in sci-fi. I should say I'm way more well versed in Star Wars specifically and fantasy at this moment. But from what I've read, whether for this channel or just for the hell of it, sci-fi very much is about the ideas and story and then the characters and emotions and themes. Maybe less themes so, but definitely characters and emotional involvement is typically a toss to the wayside and in favor of ideas and themes and such. There's nothing wrong with that, but if you're somebody who cares about character development and being emotionally attached to things, I think a lot of sci-fi struggles with that, especially the older sci-fi. But I think this strikes a good balance of kind of doing everything from being thought-provoking to having great themes to being emotional and having a pretty good plot, all things considered. Your mileage may vary. I've heard people say this is better than Hyperion. I've heard people say it's a worthy successor, but doesn't hold up to Hyperion. I've heard people say they just don't like it. So there really is, when you have such a diverse range of thought on a work, I think that means it's definitely stood the test of time. So I think it's worth your time. I can't say if you like the first one, you'll enjoy this. You might have loved the first one and not enjoy this. You really just have to kind of decide for yourself. But I do think there's a incredible story here. And even still, I feel like I barely understood everything. But we get a lot more world building here. We got the world building in the first book through the characters and their short stories, which kind of expanded the world from there. Here we get direct mentions of hegemony, which is basically the Galactic Empire, the humans that are in control of everything. We learn how they, there was extragalactic life in this setting, but we eradicated it to terraform, to colonize planets. The reason there's no aliens in this sci-fi world is because we got rid of them, which I think is interesting. A lot of stuff to do with corporations, and I mean, even the basically president of the hegemony is titled the CEO. So there's that, and a lot of there's time travel in here. There's AI, classic AI taking over, kind of, but there's actually like 3 different factions, and all of them agree about wiping out humanity. So that's also a thing. Faith is a thing in here. It actually reminds me of a video by this man named Pilgrim's Pass, who I don't necessarily always agree with stuff on, but he did make an interesting video about how sci-fi, strangely enough, always tends to be very religious. Not to a specific creed or religion, but just in the sense of scope, in the sense of themes, it comes off very religious. It very much does the same sort of thing, when you enter a church, especially like a Catholic church, and you see those, the grand building and the reverence and the art, and even if nothing else, you can wonder at the spectacle of what humanity has made in honor of what they believe in. I feel like sci-fi, especially the older sci-fi, tends to do that, and Dan Simmons does that extremely well with making this sort of transcendence in the story. There's this very bigger than us sort of thematic element to it that I think is really interesting, and I love when sci-fi can do that, make this vast and wonderful and interesting setting. Well, I wouldn't say Hyperion is necessarily the most wonderful setting. It's actually is pretty scary at times, but I really love how sci-fi can do that. How it can make you think beyond yourself to something larger, ethereal, and not necessarily God or anything, but just something beyond humanity. And I think this book does a great job of that. But overall, I mean, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a ton. There are parts of it that I was kind of like, especially near the beginning, where I didn't know exactly where everything was kind of going. By the time this concludes, though, I think I was pretty satisfied with everything I saw. For me, at least. I mean, you may not be. Like I said, very divisive book, I think. There are 2 more books in this series, which are even more divisive. This feels like a fairly solid ending. It is clearly leading to more by the end of this book with some of the revelations we get. But it feels like a pretty solid conclusion, at least to these character stories. So if you wanted to stop here, you could. But there is Edamine, or I don't even know how you say it, Endymion, I don't know, the fudge you say that word, and the rise of that. So those are the next 2. When I'm going to get around to those, probably not for a while, but they're on the to-do list. But I recommend it. And I'm getting some spoilers. If you don't want any spoilers, there's a door. So John Keats, because Dan Simmons is obsessed to the brim with this old poet named John Keats, and I picked up the Hyperion Cantos just so I could appreciate the things that Dan Simmons does in this book a little bit more. And yeah, I mean, listen, if you're a huge fan of John Keats for some random reason, you're gonna love this book. If you're not, you might look up John Keats after the fact. I mean, it's quite crazy. So there is at this time in this book, and we kind of got hints to it in the last book, but it's very clear here. There's a war against the hegemony, or the hegemony. I don't know how you're supposed to say this. So the same problem in Star Wars with the Tion hegemony. Is that how it goes? I don't even know. Anyway, there's a war against them right now with these things called the or the Otarks, or I don't even know how to say it, but it's this other faction of humans that had separated from the hegemony early on, and they're not normal humans anymore. Kind of. It's a very, again, there's no aliens in this setting. It's all just human. At least in these two books. And it's this weird sort of thing where, you know, they don't necessarily seem as human, but they are definitely human. Yeah. Also, Hoyt from the first book is just murdered in this book fairly early on, which I was not expecting. So that got to me. I wasn't like sad, but I was like, what? Okay. Also on my notes, because I got notes here. Onto do you think the Ultimates in the core will succeed in constructing their ultimate intelligence? Severn? Will they build God, I said? There are those AIs which do not want to build God. They learn from the human experience that to construct the next step in awareness is an invitation to slavery, if not actual extinction. But would a true God extinguish his creatures? In the case of the core and the hypothetical UI, God is the creature, not the creator. Perhaps the God must create the lesser beings in contact with it in order for it to feel any responsibility for them. Yet the core has appeared to take responsibility for human beings in the centuries since the AI secession, said Gladstone. She was gazing intently at me as if gauging something by my expression. Gauging, sorry. I looked out at the garden. The path glowed whitely, almost eerily in the dark. The core works towards its own ends, I said, knowing as I spoke that no human being knew the fact better than CEO Miena Gladstone. And do you feel that humanity no longer figures as a means towards those ends? I made a dismissive gesture with my right hand. I'm a creature of neither culture, I said again, neither graced by the naivete of the unintentional creators, nor cursed by the terrible awareness of their creatures. Genetically, you are fully human, said Gladstone. It was not a question. I did not respond. Jesus Christ was said to be fully human, she said, and also fully divine. Humanity and Godhead at intersection. I was amazed at a reference to that old religion. Christianity had been replaced first by Zen Christianity, then Zen Gnosticism, then by 100 more vital theologies and philosophies. Gladstone's homeworld was no repository for discarded beliefs, and I assumed and hoped that neither was the CEO. If he was fully human and fully God, I said, then I am his antimatter image. So, there's a lot of connecting pieces here. For example, some of the stories that I didn't care for in the first book are slightly enhanced now because of the context of this book. So, for instance, we had that one investigative police girl, Brania, or whatever, on the first book, who sort of had this like detective noir sort of story that she told. And her lover, which was like this, like, it's still a little hard to grasp in my mind, right? Like it is a flesh and blood body, but the mind, while attached to the body, is also attached to this like AI core, which is like this, just basically like the internet, I imagine, or something of that equivalent that it can access. Sort of. I'm a very small brain. I don't have a big brain. I didn't go to college. I'm trying to grasp. Okay. Maybe you can help me out in the comments, but essentially, that's what's going on with that. Like it's a brain connected to its own brain, own flesh and blood, but also can connect to this higher plane, I guess, in a sense, right? So this guy that is now the main character of this book is not the same as the guy that she loved, but it is the same person. Again, it's a different body. It's the same thing. It doesn't have the same memories as that one, but it is essentially the same thing. And it was very confusing. It's like a mix between a AI, artificial intelligence slash a clone. It's kind of bizarre, and I'm like I said, I'm really dumb, so I'm trying to make sense of that. But that story went up because of the fact that that it's connected to that. We also Keats slash Severin, because he's known as John Keats, and Brahmia called him like Johnny, which is like a clone person of John Keats, the poet from like what, the 1700s or whatever it was. Like, okay. But Arendez, if you guys don't remember, is the man who would have probably married Rachel if she didn't start aging backwards, and he's now like 60 something, but he talks to Keats. We also learned that after Hoyt died, his wish was for Father Dor to live, and the strike supposedly grants wishes. So Hoyt dies, but Father Dor returns alive due to the cruciform, the crucifixes that like impalements on the skin that we learned from the first short story that was fantastic from the first book is coming back here. So it is interesting. We also learned that Gladstone, the CEO of everything, has some history with Brahmia's father. Let me go back to my phone. No reassurance that the pain and sacrifice have been worth anything. Only pain. Pain and darkness, and then pain again. Sol's hand stopped moving on its infant's back. And that made you lose your faith? Dor looked at Sol. On the contrary, it made me feel that faith is all the more essential. Pain, darkness have been our lot since the fall of man. But there must be some hope that we can rise to a higher level. That consciousness can evolve to a plane more benevolent than its counterpoint of a universe hardwired to indifference. Sol nodded slowly. I had a dream during Rachel's long battle with Merlin's sickness. My wife, Sarai, I don't know. I don't remember what I said in the first review. Had the same dream, that I was being called to sacrifice my only daughter. Yes, said Dor. I listened to the council summary on disc. Then you know my response, said Sol. First, that Abraham's path of obedience can no longer be followed, even if there is a God demanding such obedience. Second, that we have offered sacrifices to that God for too many generations, that the payments of pain must stop. Yet you are here, said Dor, gesturing toward the valley, the tombs, the night. I'm here, agreed Sol, but not to grovel, rather to see what response these powers have to my decision. He touched his daughter's back again. Rachel is a day and a half old now and growing younger each second. If the Shrike is the architect of such cruelty, I want to face him, even if he is your Antichrist. If there is a God, and he has done this thing, I will show the same contempt to him. Perhaps we've all shown too much contempt as it is, mused Dor. There's a beautiful passage we'll get to. But ultimately, it gets to the point where Sol has thought about everything going on with the whole bringing up the biblical parallels and everything, and Abraham giving up Isaac, and he gives Rachel to the Shrike. And I'll read those passages. I think they're very powerful, but it's a big moment in the book, and actually makes a whole bunch of things happen for the last book and this book, which we'll get into in a little bit. But that was also pretty crazy, but we'll get to that. So, the great change is when humankind accepts its role as part of the natural order of the universe, instead of its role as a cancer. Cancer. It is an ancient disease which, yes, said Dor, I know what cancer was. How is it like humankind? Sacchardine's perfectly modulated, softly accented tone showed a hint of agitation. We spread out through the galaxy like cancer cells through a living body, Dewar. We multiply without thought to the countless life forms that must die or be pushed aside so that we may breed and flourish. We eradicate competing forms of intelligent life, such as the Senshai, empaths on Hebron, the marsh, centaurs of Garden. The entire ecology was destroyed on Garden, Dewar, so that a few thousand human colonists might live where a million of native life forms once had thrived. Dor touched his cheek with a curled finger. That is one of the drawbacks of terraforming. We did not terraform Whirl, the Templar said quickly, but the Jovian life forms there were hunted to extinction. But no one has sustained that the Zeppelins were intelligent, said Dewar, hearing the lack of conviction in his own voice. They sang, said the Templar. They called across thousands of kilometers of atmosphere to each other in songs which held meaning and love and sorrow, yet they were hunted to death like the great whales of old Earth. Dewar folded his hands. Agreed, there have been injustices, but surely there's a better way to right them than to support the cruel philosophy of the Shrike cult, and to allow this war to go on. The Templars and the Shrike cult, religious factions, obviously the Shrike cult worships the Shrike, sees it as like this lord of pain. I think the Yusong Vong from Star Wars would enjoy him immensely, actually. Maybe not, because he's maybe a machine? Question mark? That's still kind of a mystery on exactly what the Shrike is. But, you know, he just puts you on a world tree of pain, so, I mean, that's something. But I think it was just really interesting sort of world-building thing of that humanity has spread across the stars and galaxies, but that they were killing intelligent life in order to do so. Now here's the big crescendo. I think this may be one of the central themes of the narrative and of the work itself, and maybe even of the previous work leading up to this. I mean, I guess if it was supposed to be one book, that would be the case. But this is essentially it. And there are parts of it that I don't agree. I didn't take the entire chapter, which would unsupport the narrative. I actually sent this to a Discord channel, and I had to immediately backtrack because my friend thought that it was like, you know, they're very not religious, and they thought I was, you know, yeah. It's like, well, I really don't agree with that book's premise or decision, and that's not the idea here. Like again, like I said, I think at most what this book does, if anything, is invite a sort of mysticism to still have wonder in this universe. But it most certainly is not ascribing to Christianity or even any sort of deity or just believing in anything higher than ourselves, really. I think the actual main idea is maybe us being our own God, or worshiping a future version of us which is more enlightened and better, that we can evolve and change to be better, which is kind of Star Trek in a way. I know Gene Roddenberry was very much all about that. Luckily, Deep Space Nine destroyed that notion because humans are never going to change. I'm sorry. We can get better, but we will never be. There will never not be conflict. If heaven exists, maybe, but as long as humans exist on this planet, there will be suffering. I'm sorry. That is the case. But I still think, whether you don't believe in any god, you just, you're okay with like mysticism in Star Wars. I think this is also a similar sort of vibe to that. But I think in between the nuggets of the grand thing that he's saying, there is, to those who are religious, I think there's a transcendent truth cast down upon these pages, even if unintentional, with the certain snippets that I wrote down. But this is the big one. So here we are with the big moment, for me at least. Sol Wintrub suddenly understood perfectly why Abraham had agreed to sacrifice Isaac, his son, when the Lord commanded him to do so. It was not obedience. It was not even to put the love of God above the love of his son. Abraham was testing God. By denying the sacrifice at the last moment, by stopping the knife, God had earned the right, in Abraham's eyes, in the hearts of his offspring, to become the God of Abraham. soul shuddered as he thought of how no posturing on Abraham's part, no shaming of his willingness to sacrifice the boy, could have served to forge the bond between greater power and humankind. Abraham had to know, in his own heart, that he would kill his son. The deity, whatever form it then took, had to know Abraham's determination, had to feel that sorrow and commitment to destroy what was to Abraham the most precious thing in the universe. Abraham came not to sacrifice, but to know once and for all whether this God was a God to be trusted and obeyed. No other test would do. I think that's pretty incredible, to kind of twist that on its head, to make that, that story is as old as time, the Old Testament tale of Abraham and Isaac up on the mountain as Abraham goes to sacrifice his son to God. And there's people, I'm not going to get super into it. People have talked about that for decades and then centuries and millennia, and people will continue to discuss it long after I'm dead, positively and negatively. I have plenty of atheists will use that as a gotcha. But it is interesting to switch the narrative a bit. And we always talk about God testing Abraham's obedience. But if Abraham was testing God, a God that's worthy of worship would not ask me to kill my son. So if he's true, if he's real, if he's good, then he will stop me. But that means I have to be willing to actually do it. It's just a twisting. It's simple and yet so complex, that shift of mindset. But even still, if you're religious, you can still flip that back to that was the test. That he wanted Abraham to not be blind. That he didn't want Abraham to just be willing to slaughter his own child because I wouldn't ask you to do that. So I damn sure hope you're questioning me on that front. And that you pray everything in your whole soul that I would make you stop. Because if you're willing to do that with no hesitation, probably not a follower I want. But regardless, I thought it was a very interesting portion of the book and kind of frames the overall thematic bits of this book. So, also, the console does manage to just completely destroy the web, or at least make it disconnected. And the web itself is like the technocore, these AIs, planned on, well, some of them, not all of them, they didn't all agree, but some wanted to get rid of humanity. And the thing too, at least as far as I understood, is that a lot of humans, kind of like Deus Ex, if you ever played Human Revolution, a lot of, or Cyberpunk, a lot of people, they use these things to keep them young, like Gladstone, she looked her age. But other people, they were like 60, but they still looked like they were 20 or 30. And that was because they were connected to the web. And other enhancements like that. And so since their brains were connected, you could just unplug them, kill them then and there through that. Now sort of the idea, the plan was to do that, or at least some of the technocore plan on doing that, at least as far as my little brain is understanding. But the console blows it up, so stops that from happening, and like it still exists and they're still in the web. Like you can't really destroy the web, but humans just aren't connected to it anymore. And then one more from the book. Love. The most banal of things, the most cliched of religious motivations, had more power, Soul now knew, than did strong nuclear force or weak nuclear force or electromagnetism or gravity. Love was these other forces, Soul realized. The void which binds, the subquantum impossibility that carried information from photon to photon, was nothing more or less than love. But could love, simple, banal love, explain the so-called anthropic principle which scientists had shaken their collective heads over for 7 centuries and more? that almost infinite string of coincidences which had led to a universe that had just the proper number of dimensions, just the correct value of an electron, just the precise rule for gravity, just the proper age to stars, just the right prebiologies to create just the perfect viruses to become just the proper DNAs. In short, a series of coincidences so absurd in all their precision and correctness that they defied logic, defied understanding, and even defied religious interpretations. Love. Now, again, he's talking more about his love for his daughter, right? And the love he has for his friends and the people he's met along the way. And is that, transcendent and all encompassing. But I still think, like, if you're religious, you could look at that as like the perfect little section there to be like, yes, there's a bunch of these little. If the Earth was even a centimeter off of where it is in the solar system, we couldn't sustain life on this planet. Just couldn't. We're far away enough from the sun that it doesn't burn us alive, but close enough that it produces good crops and such things. The moon is far enough away to not cause total tides to kill us and murder us, but close enough to do its job. There's a lot of those little mini coincidences throughout. This is why people are so insistent upon creating or discovering a multiverse, which is more unlikely than the belief in God. Right? Because there's nothing for it. There's no evidence. There's no historical writings on the multiverse. There's theories about a multiverse. But I mean, if we're gonna go, if we're going based off of evidence, which people always like to complain about with religious stuff, well then there's as much evidence for the multiverse as there is for God. Actually less, but that's a whole other thing. So, but people want that to be true. Because if a multiverse is true, if there's an infinity number of possibility, then you seemingly dissuade God from the equation because, well, of course we have Earth and we're able to live on it. We're just one of the lucky ones. There's billions of other, there's trillions of other universes that are just like ours. We just can't access them. But there's no special deity needed. But even if there was a multiverse and there was an infinity of possibility, there would still have to be, because they want to escape the Big Bang. Because if there's a beginning, it means something existed before that. So they go multiverse, but the multiverse doesn't help matters. It just basically makes the problem go on longer. But you still have to originally find a beginning point that started all of the universes. Unless you can show that all universes always existed, always. But that's obviously not the case, because our universe, at least, is expanding. Which it can't expand. There'd be nothing to expand if it always existed. Sorry to mess with you with some philosophy and science right now, but if the universe can't expand if it always existed, it would already be at its state. There would be no expansion because it would have already done everything. There's no expansion to be had, but it's still expanding because there was a point where it wasn't like that, right? So it's been expanding since. So that is, again, an example that there was a starting point. But regardless of all that, the idea, what you could take away from it if you were religious, that love, family, friends, partners, and the Creator, that all it took for creation was a single act of love. That's very powerful. Don't have to take it that way. I'm just saying, food for thought. I know he didn't mean it that way, but you can make it be that way. Again, death of the author. I know full well that's not what the author was going for, but it is something you could take away from the text to make your life better, if need be. Which is kind of what art's all about. To some extent, you begin with what did the author intend, then you also have to go with what you took away from it. So, but I love this part of the book. Soul is probably my favorite character. I mean, everything with his daughter Rachel, when he has to endure through that, powerful stuff. And his crisis of faith and everything else is also just peak sci-fi. Also, another big revelation, we learned that Rachel is Moneta, which again, this kind of slightly makes the previous book better just by virtue of this knowledge, which is that the Cassad storyline, the soldier storyline, which was like my least favorite in the last book, his lover, Moneta, is actually Rachel, because Sol gives his child to the Shrike. He allows this sacrifice because the only reason he does it is because he says he hears a version of his daughter telling him to do so, which, how do you know that's not God? Anyway, separate thing. But so he gives his daughter to the Shrike. The Shrike goes through this time portal, and she's sent to the far future where she grows up again, right? And she goes back, and she meets Cassad, and all this stuff, and it all comes full circle, which just automatically makes that first story better by the enhancement of that being here. So that was pretty time travel crazy stuff with Rachel actually being Moneta and that whole thing. And there's still stuff with her to come apparently in the future, which we maybe will read about, maybe we won't, I don't know. But it's interesting all the same. Also, Bronya is able to hold her own against the Shrike. Why? Well, you see John Keats, who is this clone thing, right, that's kind of been the main character of this book. He was a sort of John the Baptist in a sense. He was the messenger, the one who comes before, which made me think of R. Scott Baker's work, which was funny. The darkness that came before. But he's the one that comes before. And supposedly, Bronya's baby is going to be the one who teaches this great savior, this sci-fi savior, I suppose. And I still don't fully understand that either. But yeah, Bronya's going to have this baby. It's gonna be a girl, and she's gonna like save the day or something in the future. I don't know. I don't know. The book just ends, man. But everybody's kind of happy, and good. The hegemony seems to be destroyed, and the oysters are taken over or whatever they're called. But they're living happy. And I really don't know where anything's headed other than little hints they give with the baby inside of Bronya's and what that might mean. So I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait and see if any of that comes to fruition. If Rachel will come back, I don't know. But it's interesting all the same. But like I said, it was a fun book. There were parts of it where I was kind of like, move on. But it was a good time. It was a good story. And I had a lot of fun with it. And hopefully you did too. I don't know if I didn't offend you with anything I said in this video, but no. Broadcast yourself, right? So overall, I enjoyed it immensely, and I hope you did too. Whatever you thought about it, let me know in the comment section below. And until next time, guys. What does Selenius like to say? I don't know. He says a lot of crazy things, but he likes to cuss a lot too. But I don't know. But I guess to those you love, hold on to them tightly. I mean, I assume most of your loved ones are not going to start aging backwards. But you never know when things might come to an end. So take care of them. Till next time.